Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we grab a bunch of sources and pull out the key stuff you need to know quick. Think of it as your shortcut to getting up to speed.
Exactly. Saves you the reading time.
Right. So today, we're jumping into the really fascinating history, the evolution of short-term mission trips. We're going to focus specifically on one church, Central Wheaton Church, CWC.
And the sources we have are pretty good. There's an academic paper, lots of interview bits, historical details. Gives a solid picture.
Yeah, it does. So our mission, if you will, is to figure out how these trips started, what drove them, the motivations, and also the debates that are still kind of going on about their purpose and impact.
You get some surprising facts in there, definitely.
Yeah.
And some very human stories, too.
For sure.
Yeah.
So I'm your guide, and with me is our expert, ready to unpack this.
Absolutely. It's interesting how looking closely at one church, like CWC, can actually tell you a lot about bigger trends in, well, modern evangelicalism and even beyond.
Okay, let's kick off with the early days then. At Central Wheaton Church, CWC. So the story really starts with this guy, Sam Johnson. He became the youth pastor there way back in 1984.
Right. And before they were sending kids overseas, they were doing service trips, but within the U.S.
Yeah, places like the west side of Chicago, rural Mississippi, New Orleans, even New York City. And get this, some of those first trips weren't just youth, they were multi-generational, families going together.
That multi-generational thing is quite interesting, isn't it? It suggests they saw service as something for the whole church, not just, teenagers.
Exactly. But then things started to shift towards foreign missions. Sam Johnson apparently got inspired by youth leaders writing in magazines, Group Magazine, Youth Specialties publication.
Oh, yeah, those were pretty influential back then. And Paul Borthwick was a key figure.
That's the name, Borthwick. He wrote a booklet in '81, something like How to Plan, Develop, and Lead a Youth Missionary Team.
He did, and it was surprisingly practical stuff. Not just vague ideas, like actual advice on who to contact, even what kinds of photos to take. 12 group shots, 10 touring shots. Really specific.
Wow, okay. And the foreword to that by Gordon MacDonald, it really talked up the transformative power, right? A parent seeing their kids come back changed, like men and women, some feeling called to ministry.
Yeah, and Borthwick himself laid out these three main reasons for youth STM. He called them modeling, memories, and missionaries.
Modeling, memories, missionaries, so spiritual growth, personal development, and maybe finding future missionaries.
Pretty much sums up the early thinking. And notice how much of that is about the impact on the kids going, alongside maybe recruiting for the future.
And it's worth remembering, foreign trips for youth back in the early 80s, pretty rare, actually.
Oh, absolutely. Much more common were like retreats, camps, maybe those domestic service projects you mentioned.
Right. Group Magazine even had an ad in '87 for work camps, but they were all in the U.S. No international options listed there.
So CWC going international with youth was, well, kind of ahead of the curve at that point. It wasn't the standard thing yet.
But things changed fast. Just 2 years later, 1989, Group Magazine is featuring an international work camp down in Mexico.
And the language they used, talking about changing lives, inspiring faith.
Yeah, exactly. But interestingly, they didn't really use the specific term short-term missions yet. The model was there, though, short trip, service, another country.
And right from the get-go, you see this tension. It's there in the appeals, the idea of serving others, doing good work.
But also,
maybe just as strongly, the focus on what the participants themselves would get out of it. The personal growth, the spiritual development, that dynamic, that balance. It's kind of core to the whole story.
Yeah, that tension seems key. Okay, so that leads us nicely into CWC's first foreign youth trip, Ecuador, 1986.
Big step for them.
Huge. Sam Johnson, the youth pastor, he was really convinced it would deepen the kids' faith, broaden their worldview, even though there were some nerves about it in the church, apparently.
Well, you can imagine. Sending teenagers to another country, mid-'80s. Logistically, safety-wise. Yeah, would have felt like a big deal.
Definitely. And it wasn't short. 21 days. 17 high schoolers. Sam said his goal was partly to support the missionaries already working there.
Okay, connecting with existing work.
Yeah, and also to really help the students develop a Christian worldview. But here's a fascinating bit he mentioned.
Go on.
Fundraising. It was actually easier to raise money for this big Ecuador trip than for the shorter, less exotic trips to Chicago.
Really? That seems counterintuitive.
Right. He literally said Chicago didn't have the travel glamour of an international trip. The glamour factor made fundraising easier.
Wow. That says quite a bit, doesn't it? About perceptions, maybe motivations of donors, even the appeal for the participants, the novelty, the distance.
Makes you think. Anyway, the trip itself involved a lot. They visited schools, a prison, churches, orphanages, worked with HCJB, the radio ministry.
So a real mix of activities.
Yeah, and cultural stuff, traveled to the Amazon, and crucially, they worked with a long-term missionary CWC already supported and an Ecuadorian evangelist.
That collaboration piece is important. It shows an early attempt, at least, to tie the short-term thing into ongoing efforts.
And the kids were involved in ministry too, sharing testimonies, though, in English, needing translation, using puppets, music, mime.
Kind of classic youth group ministry styles from that era.
Totally. And Sam really emphasized the impact it had on them, their excitement, realizing God could use them. He said, years later, they still talk about that trip.
And those personal stories, those lasting memories, that perception of it being life-changing, that's what really fueled the growth of this whole movement, those powerful narratives.
Okay, so that's the youth side getting started. Let's shift gears a bit. What about adult short-term missions at CWC?
Right, so there's another key person here, Barney Torrance. He was the director of Christian education, started back in '75.
And his own experience seems to have been, pretty formative. He took a sabbatical in '83, went to Manila.
And apparently had a rough time with culture shock there.
Yeah, quite a negative experience, it sounds like. Which, maybe surprisingly, led him to make what he called a deal with the Lord.
Deal.
To run the missions program back at CWC. He was also inspired by his mother-in-law, who was passionate about foreign missions. Before that sabbatical, sending regular church members abroad wasn't really his focus.
So his own difficult experience kind of pushed him towards leading missions. That's interesting.
Seems so. Anyway, the first adult trip they organized was to Bolivia. The plan was to build an addition for a long-term missionary.
A construction project. Sounds straightforward enough.
Well, not quite. They ran into problems. Unexpected issues with the foundation, red tape, paperwork nightmares.
The realities of building things in different contexts. It's often not as simple as it looks on paper.
Exactly. And it was during that trip, dealing with those headaches, that Barney had this kind of light bulb moment. A pivotal realization.
Okay, what was it?
He decided the main point wasn't the building project itself. It wasn't the work. Drawing on his own struggles in the Philippines, he concluded the primary purpose was actually about changing the participants.
So the work became secondary.
Pretty much. He actually said the work is really secondary to the purpose of the program, which is to change people who go. That's a huge shift in thinking, right?
That is a massive shift. It fundamentally reframes the whole endeavor. It's less about the task, more about the transformation of the person doing the task. That became such a central argument for STM later on.
He believed in it so strongly, he convinced the mission board to offer, basically, a money-back guarantee.
You're kidding. A guarantee.
Yep. A refund if the trip didn't change your life.
Yeah.
He also talked about benefits for the long-term missionaries, like, social contact for their kids, support when they were on furlough.
That guarantee is quite something. Shows incredible conviction in the power of the experience itself. And the missionary benefits, while maybe secondary to his main point, show a link to the existing field.
Now, not everyone bought into it right away. There was criticism, mainly about the cost. Was this the best use of money compared to supporting long-term work?
The perennial question, really. Cost effectiveness.
But Barney saw it differently. He argued these trips were an amazing tool for discipleship. He even called them the best tool for discipleship at the church.
Framing it as discipleship, not just mission outreach. That's another key justification that emerged.
And CWC really ran with it. They became leaders in STM pretty quickly. Barney got invited to speak at national conferences. The church even set this incredibly ambitious goal.
What was that?
To have 50%, half of its members participate in a short-term mission trip.
50%. Wow.
Right.
That shows a huge level of institutional commitment. They weren't just dipping their toes in. They were diving head first.
For sure. And this boom at CWC, it wasn't happening in a vacuum, right? It ties into that wider trend people started calling voluntourism in the late 80s, early 90s.
Right. You had books like Bill McMillan's Volunteer Vacations coming out in '87. And organizations starting up or growing.
Like Habitat for Humanity, Global Volunteers, Cross-Cultural Solutions. Groups offering chances to travel and do service projects, sometimes with a cultural exchange focus, too.
And importantly, not all of those were explicitly religious organizations. It suggests a broader interest in society, combining travel with doing good, maybe.
Yeah, good point. But the sources highlight a key difference with the church-based STM movement.
Which was?
The sheer number of teenagers involved, junior high, senior high students, apparently that was much more pronounced in STM than in some other forms of volunteerism.
Ah, yes, the youth focus. That does seem particularly strong in the evangelical STM world. It lines up with that emphasis on discipleship, spiritual formation for young people.
And you saw that reflected in publishing, too. The 90s had a whole wave of books coming out specifically promoting youth STM.
So it's becoming normalized, even expected within youth ministry culture.
Exactly. But alongside this growth, there was also more questioning, more debate. The source calls it contestation about what STM actually was and what it was for.
People starting to ask harder questions, basically.
Yeah. Like, someone named Kim Hurst tried to coin a new term, vacations with a purpose, VWAP, trying to capture the mix of culture, service, becoming world Christians.
VWAP. Never really caught on, though, did it?
Nope. Seems like the word mission, even with all its baggage, just had more resonance within that evangelical context than vacation, even a purposeful one.
The theological framing mattered, perhaps.
Seems likely. And then you had some pretty direct debates playing out in print, like in Evangelical Missions Quarterly in '92.
Oh, right, the Seth Barnes versus Leslie Pelt discussion.
That's the one. Barnes arguing STM could actually revitalize missions, mobilize new people. Pelt pushing back, defending the traditional idea of long-term career missionaries.
Yeah, Pelt was even hesitant to call short-termers missionaries at all. Really highlights that clash between new models and established views of what mission meant.
But despite the debates, by the 90s, especially for youth, these trips were becoming pretty standard fare. Group magazine was covering summer missions way more.
So it was embedding itself in the rhythm of church life.
It seems so. And moving into the 2000s, the critiques didn't disappear, especially around cost and, actual effectiveness, but the nature of the debate shifted.
How so?
It wasn't so much if these trips counted as mission anymore, but more about were they good missions? Were they worth the investment? Practical value became the focus.
A shift from definition to efficacy.
Right. You see major mission journals like Mission Frontiers and EMQ doing cover stories on STM around the year 2000. The tone was maybe more critical, more analytical than before.
But ultimately,
They seem to acknowledge, okay, STM is here to stay. We need to figure out how to work with it, how to make it better. Someone named Gary Corwin basically said mission agencies had to accept or die.
accept or die. That's pretty blunt. Suggests the momentum was just too strong to ignore. The language, the category of STM was becoming settled, even if the best practices weren't.
Yeah, the arguments after 2000 seem more focused on process, methods, motives, rather than the fundamental definition. How do we do this well?
And you had educators, maybe not fully buying the theological imperative, but seeing this huge trend and wanting to steer it in a positive direction.
It's really crucial, though, and the sources point this out, to remember whose voices shaped this story.
Meaning?
Well, the history of STM language, the debates, it's largely coming from leadership, often like CWC, a white, evangelical, Midwestern kind of context.
Right. Early literature, especially for youth, didn't feature many women's voices or non-Western perspectives. That's a significant gap.
Absolutely. And CWC's early model, remember, focused on connecting with their supported missionaries, not necessarily partnering directly with local churches or leaders initially.
Which is different from the partnership models that became more emphasized later on.
Yeah.
Though those bring their own set of challenges, around power dynamics and who sets the agenda.
Definitely complex. But the point is, understanding how this whole STM narrative got built is key to making sense of individual experiences.
How so?
Because the power of the narrative isn't just in the words. It's in how it gets embodied, how it shapes the whole experience beforehand through all the practices.
Like the preparation, the interviews, the fundraising letters, the training sessions.
Exactly. It all prefigures the experience. An anthropologist might say culture works like that this mix of words, ideas, actions, all shaping people.
Yeah, the logic of practice. Ideas and ways of doing things become accepted, become influential. Just through repetition and reinforcement, they start to feel normal, inevitable even.
So these trips aren't just trips. They're embedded in this whole cultural system, this narrative framework that tells you what to expect, how to feel, what it all means.
Which helps explain both their power and maybe some of the criticisms.
Right. So, okay, bring this all together. We've kind of walked through the evolution, haven't we? From those early domestic trips at CWC.
To the rise of international youth and adult programs becoming this huge movement.
We've looked at how the language changed, the debates about purpose service versus transformation, cost versus benefit.
And touched on those underlying narratives, the cultural frameworks shaping it all.
Hopefully for you listening, this gives you that quick, deep understanding we aim for. Maybe a few aha moments about how STM developed and why it looks the way it does.
It is fascinating how persistent it is, isn't it? Despite all the critiques and debates over decades, the appeal seems incredibly durable. That mix of wanting to help, wanting to see the world, wanting personal growth, it's a powerful combination.
It really is. And that kind of leads us to a final thought for you to chew on. Thinking about this whole history, this evolution,
Mm.
what do you think are the main reasons for STM's enduring appeal, and also for the ongoing debates?
And maybe how do those insights apply elsewhere to other kinds of short-term volunteering or service efforts you might see or be involved in?
Yeah. That fundamental tension we talked about, the balance between making an impact on others and the personal change we seek for ourselves. Where does that balance lie? Lots to think about.
Definitely food for thought.
Well, that's our deep dive for today. Thanks for exploring this with us.